My name is Ted Landsmark. I am a professor of public policy here in the School of Public Policy within the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. You've tuned in to our penultimate open classroom session, which is focused this semester on hate crimes, anti-Semitism, anti-Asian hate, reconciliation, and tonight with a strong focus on reparations. Today's been an interesting day on campus and in Boston. In Boston, there has been extended and deep discussion today about a city council resolution that would create a commission within the city council to begin to look at issues of reparations in Boston. And rather coincidentally, on campus, Professor Margaret Burnham in our law school organized and presented a quite extraordinary conference covering issues of reparations with voices heard from around the country on many of the philosophical and theoretical issues surrounding reparations, but also there were discussions and workshops that covered legislation and specific activities that have been generated by cities and communities around the United States to begin to address the questions of reparations. I will turn this microphone over to our dean to introduce the substance of our conversations, and then I hope and expect that we'll have a very engaging conversation this evening. I remind folks that this event this evening is being live cast and that the program will be archived, and we invite folks in our audience here in the auditorium and the extended audience online to send in any questions or comments that you may have, because at the later portions of this session, we're going to open up for questions and answers. And so with that, I am delighted to introduce the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern, Uta Poyger. Dean Poyger.
Thank you very much, Professor Landsmark. I want to start out by thanking, maybe by taking off my mask away from you all. I want to start out by thanking Simon Rabinowitz, Ted Landsmark, Jonathan Kaufman, Laurie Lefkowitz, and Margaret Burnham for the collaborative spirit of this evening's conversation. A conversation, as Professor Landsmark has said, about difficult topics of restitution after historical injustice, a discussion also of what we can learn from comparison. It is great to see this collaboration between Northeastern's Holocaust Awareness Committee and the Open Classroom on repairing a divided America. And I want to thank Menachem Kaiser for inspiring the particular conversation tonight. This evening's conversation, again, as Professor Landsmark has already mentioned, caps a day where Margaret Burnham and the Civil Rights Restorative Justice Project and the School of Law and the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs convened an important conversation with policymakers around the country. This was a conversation about how we can think about restitution, reparations at the local level after historical injustice, after slavery, after racist violence, after lynching, a conversation extremely urgent in the United States in 2021 and gaining some traction, as we were just reminded, in Boston right now as well. Tonight, I look forward to learning yet more about how to think about restitution at the individual and at the local level. And I look forward to our discussion of how one might transfer lessons from German restitution. And some of you might recognize that I have a German accent, and I am, among other things, also a historian who has worked a lot on comparative history and who has taught the history of the Holocaust and comparative genocide as part of her portfolio. So I look very much forward to our discussion of how one might transfer lessons from German restitution after the Holocaust and the experiences of surviving generations in that context to other contexts, especially to the American one. Again, many thanks to our organizers and to our panelists, and a very warm welcome to all of you here in the open classroom, in the physical open classroom, and to all of you in the audience on Zoom or on live stream. Thank you. And I will turn the mic over to Simon Rabinowitz, who is chairing the Holocaust Awareness Committee.
Thank you, Dean Poiger. So my name is Simon Rabinowitz, and I teach history and Jewish studies. And as was said, I chair the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee. This committee has been planning robust programming in Holocaust and genocide awareness since the 1970s, the centerpiece of which has been Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week, an annual week of study and lecture and commemoration that this year will be held April 4th to 8th. And there will be more information about that programming, and we hope to see you all there. And the idea for tonight's program actually came to us from a Northeastern parent. And so thank you to Kayla White, who approached Professor Lefkowitz and I about a book and a talented young writer who has written about a book about how his grandfather survived the Holocaust, how relatives of his grandfather survived the Holocaust. And it tells a story of his own efforts to reclaim his family property and what he learns about his family in the process. It is, as I see it, a meditation on whether the holes left by displacement and trauma can or should be repaired by subsequent generations. And we are all very thankful for Kayla White for bringing us bringing that to our attention, as it was a wonderful opportunity for us to highlight an important piece of work. And then our collaborators in the open classroom, Ted Landsmark and Jonathan Kaufman, had the brilliant idea of pairing this conversation or pairing this author in conversation with Margaret Burnham, a lawyer, judge, activist, and scholar who's been at the forefront of a similar process of exploring the legal means to restore justice to historic injustices. And it's really been a real pleasure for all of us who are part of the Jewish Studies program to work with Ted and Jonathan in the open classroom over the course of the semester as we work through these questions on the important theme of healing a divided America. I also want to thank the faculty, students, and staff who serve on the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee, to all of the departments and programs who sponsored tonight's events. They are many. To Dean Uta Poiger for her support for this important programming. To Deborah Levison and Gabby Fiorenza for making sure everything runs without a hitch. And lastly, to my partner in everything Jewish Studies, Professor Lori Lefkowitz, who directs both the Jewish Studies program and the Humanities Center at the university. Now, today's program explores the theme of restorative justice by putting into conversation two people who have actively considered the ramifications of historic injustice. And I think a lot of the connections will become clear over the course of their words and what they have to say. So for now, I'm just going to introduce our guests, who will each speak about their perspective on the question of plunder, reparations, and restorative justice. And after we hear from each of them, I'll moderate a conversation between them and pull out some threads, and then we'll open it up to the public. So Menachem Kaiser, this talented young author who wrote this book, Plunder, grew up in Toronto, as did I. In fact, only a few minutes from my house. And there's a scene in the book itself where Mr. Kaiser describes going to visit his grandfather's grave in the cemetery, which I deduced is actually the same cemetery where my own father is buried, and as we talked, not even even in the same section. Mr. Kaiser went to Columbia University and did an MFA at University of Michigan, and later held a Fulbright scholarship in Lithuania. He's a prolific journalist and has written for the New Yorker, Atlantic, Los Angeles Review of Books, and Tablet, among other publications. And it's one of those things where, you know, after reading his book Plunder and going back to look at his other journalistic publications, that I realized that I'd actually read a number of them, just not yet knowing who he was. And he's a real investigative journalist, and there was a piece in particular that I recalled having read when it came out that investigated questions of pedophilia and sexual abuse in the one particular religious community in Jerusalem. And I could see that the methods that he would later use in Plunder clearly had been practiced in that process of investigative journalism. Margaret Burnham, as we all know, is the founder and director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. She is University Distinguished Professor of Law. And for those who don't know about the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, this investigates historical instances of racial violence and provides a resource for those actively seeking seeking justice in these cases. Professor Burnham represented civil and political rights activists as a lawyer in the 1970s. In 1977, she became an associate justice in Boston's municipal court, becoming the first African-American woman on the bench in Massachusetts judiciary. In 1993, she was appointed by Nelson Mandela to serve on an international human rights commission that was a precursor to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in June, I forgot to actually ask you about the results of this nomination process, but in June, President Joe Biden nominated her to a review board that considers federal civil rights crimes between the 1940s and 1980s that had become cold cases. And is the nomination still in process, or? Still in process. All right, no further comments. I would have loved to report some exciting news, but, and finally, we eagerly await Professor Burnham's forthcoming book, By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. So I can't think of two people to be in better conversation with one another on the questions of plunder, reparations, and restorative justice. Menachem Kaiser?
Is it working? Yeah. Hi, everyone. Hi, students. It's such a huge pleasure to be here. I just want to start off by thanking everyone who made this happen. Simon, Lori, Ted, Jonathan, Margaret. I've been doing a lot of book events over the past few months, but I think this is the most exciting one. I haven't been on a campus, like a physical, real-life campus, in a long time. That being said, I'm way out of my depth here. So usually I'm the only one speaking, and I know the most about what I'm speaking about. It's not the case here. Not about Eastern Europe and not about reparations. To introduce myself, right, my name is Menachem Kaiser. I grew up in Toronto. Let me preface everything that's going to happen tonight by saying I am not a scholar. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a professor. I come at what I do as a writer. So I wrote a book. Where is it? Let me grab my book. It's called Plunder. I guess it's on the massive screen behind me. It is a memoir. It is not a work of scholarship. So that's me saying anything I say that's wrong, I've already apologized. So let me tell you a little bit about my story, sort of give you some context and sort of where I'm coming from vis-a-vis this question of reclamation or reparation. I grew up in Toronto, and my grandparents, 3 of my 4 grandparents were Holocaust survivors. That being said, I actually didn't grow up with a Holocaust legacy exactly. I didn't know anything about their Holocaust story. My grandfather, who the search in the book is really about, he died 8 years before I was born. So I didn't know him, but really beyond that, I didn't know anything about him. He was kind of a complete blank. And really sort of owing to the temperament of my family, he just wasn't really talked about. Not that anyone was hiding anything, we're just not very good at talking about dead people, I guess. And so, so I grew up with this sort of blank knowledge that my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but without any details about it. And so it informed my identity in a very general sense, but not in a particular sense. And so it wasn't something I was, to be very frank, I wasn't all that curious about it. It really didn't motivate me. My grandparents were from Poland. I easily could have gone my entire life without going to Poland. There was nothing instilled in me, like a sense of searching. There was no questions. I was really looking for answers. And so I just sort of like lived with this sort of awareness that my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but without any sort of curiosity or compulsion to investigate that. When I was 25, I got a Fulbright to go to Lithuania. It became quickly like a mess of what I was exactly researching, but let's leave it and said nothing to do with my family. My family's not from Lithuania. I didn't really go to study anything to do with the war or the Holocaust, and I ended up doing it kind of by accident. I ended up researching the Vilna Ghetto, and I found it to be unbelievably fascinating in a way that I had not been exposed to, despite going to Jewish day schools my entire life and sort of learning very vaguely about the Holocaust and about the war. Once I sort of stumbled upon the details of it, I found it to be enthralling, and I ended up dedicating quite a few years to the study of the Vilna Ghetto. At that point, I didn't feel I would ever go to Poland. I easily could have gone my entire life without going to Poland. I think of my siblings, I have 5 siblings, I think half of them have been to Poland, and they went on sort of organized memory trips, like March of the Living or heritage tours where they visit concentration camps. So they didn't go, again, on any route that had anything to do with my own family's history. How I got to Poland is a fun little story, which we don't have time to go into now, but very quickly, because it's fun, I ended up meeting a Hasidic guy from Brooklyn in Vilnius in March, which is, you do not meet American tourists in March in Vilnius. And he ended up being the road manager for the German supergroup, the Scorpions. Do you guys know? You guys know their songs, Rock You Like a Hurricane? Yeah, so I met the Scorpions in Vilnius. I actually took them to karaoke, where I begged them to sing their own songs, and they refused. And so that guy, that Hasidic guy, his dad turned out to be the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is a region that doesn't exist, but yet has a chief rabbi. Long story. They invited me to come to Krakow for Rosh Hashanah, and I was kind of like very taken with them. I thought it would be fun. So I went to Krakow. That was in 2011 for Rosh Hashanah, but still nothing to do with my family. I really went because the Scorpions / the chief rabbi of Galicia invited me. But once I was in Poland, I was there for like 2 or 3 weeks. I was like, you know what? I'm here. I should go visit my grandfather's hometown. Again, this man who I knew basically nothing about, whom I'm named after also. His full name was Myra Menachem Kaiser, which is my full legal name. And so I called my dad. I was like, look, I'm here in Poland. Do you have an address? I knew he's from the town called Sosnowiec, which is about 70 kilometers outside of Krakow. And my father's like, let me look. And he called me back a few hours later, and he read an address. He spelled it. He couldn't pronounce it, and it took me about 3 years to learn how to pronounce it. It's Małachowskiego. And for me, so I had now had a destination. So I just put it in Google Maps. I went, I saw the building. I had a kind of like somewhat forced, sentimental moment. I was like, wow, here's where my grandfather grew up. I snuck inside. I looked at all the the apartment doors. I was like, maybe he grew up here, maybe he grew up here. I didn't have the chutzpah to knock on any of the doors. Then I left. I took some photos. I went to City Hall. I turned up a handwritten birth announcement. It felt like a real sentimental journey. And then I left. I got on a train and I left. And at that point, there was no reason for me to think I'd ever go back. Why? I had no questions. I wasn't really searching anything. Like, there was no sense of an unfulfilled mission. And then over the next 3 or 4 years, I ended up spending a lot of time in Poland. I found it a lot more interesting than Lithuania, and I was having a lot more fun there. And I ended up doing more and more research that had to do with memory politics of Eastern Europe. But again, nothing to do with my family. And my father kind of kept nudging me over the years. He's like, that building you visited, that building belonged to us. That building belonged to my father, i.e. my grandfather, and he had tried to reclaim it. And not only that, we have all these documents sort of sitting, in my house in Toronto, just collecting dust. And I was like, okay, fine, it's an interesting story. I didn't really do anything about it. But I kept meeting more and more people in Poland who had embarked on their own story of reclamation, who had tried or sometimes even succeeded in getting property back. And I would mention to my dad, he's like, go take care of it. But I never looked after it. When I was in Toronto, I just didn't ask about the papers. And finally, my dad just got, tired about how lazy I was being, and he just faxed me. He faxed me. It was probably the first and last fax I've ever gotten. He faxed me all the papers to a hotel in Krakow. And that was a big night for me. I remember I went to the hotel, I picked up, there was like 60 or 70 pages in 3 languages. So they were in Polish, they were in English, they were in German, some of them were in Yiddish, some of them were translations, some of them were translations of translations, some of them had been notarized translations. It was a very confusing and unorganized heap. And I stayed up all night, and I sort of organized these pages. And really, for me, that was a big moment. That was like an honest, sentimental moment. I'm not that sentimental of a person. I don't come from that sentimental of a family. But really, I felt like I was meeting my grandfather. For the first time in my life, I saw something that he had tried to do. Like, I was able to sort of imagine his person. And what I saw was that for 30 years after the war, he had tried and failed to reclaim this property. There wasn't any sort of sentimental letters in there. There were no diary entries or anything like that. They were very bureaucratic, very administrative, sort of letters to lawyers and forms, but you could really imagine his frustration. I was able to see that the man had tried. One of them was in the early 60s. A deal had been worked out by the US and Poland to compensate people whose property had been expropriated. And my grandfather filled out the form. And then a few years later, he had written to a lawyer, and the lawyer was like, yeah, you missed the deadline. There was another form. And so you could really imagine that he had tried, he had this opportunity, and he had failed. He really just had misunderstood the instructions. And at that point, I felt like I was sort of able to enter into a conversation with him. And I was in the very fortunate position where I could sort of continue what my grandfather tried to do. And I asked another Hasidic guy for a lawyer, because who else am I going to ask for a lawyer? And he recommended a local lawyer who's known in the book as the killer. And the killer is she's like a surprisingly favorite character, I'd say, of many readers. She was a woman somewhere between the ages of 80 and 130. I don't know, who, both of her daughters worked as kind of her paralegals. They were very, very obsessed with cats. I actually downplayed it in the book how obsessed they were with cats. They used to give me my legal documents in cat folders. That's not a joke. And so I hired her, and that's how I began the reclamation process. And that was in 2015. And that's really sort of I would say the context, and also the beginning of the book is when I begin this reclamation process. And I guess we'll get more into it during the conversation, but really the effort, let's say the obstacles go along 2 tracks. I would say there's the legal obstacles, which were not what I expected. I actually had pretty good documentation that my family owned this building, but what proved to be the most complicated legal hurdle was proving to the courts that my relatives who had died in the Holocaust were in fact dead. And I guess we can unpack that a little later. And the second one, which I think will be a really interesting conversation, was the ethical/moral dilemma of sort of encountering and sort of convincing myself to confront the people who lived in the building. And so it really went along these 2 tracks. And so half the book is really about this, sort of the ongoing journey to attempt to reclaim this property and my own internal sort of struggle with that. And the other half, and I don't know, like, this is kind of far abroad of the topic at hand, has to do with treasure hunters. It's it takes so long to explain though, Simon. We'll circle back to that one. Remind me, because we have really good photos. I want to show you guys, because I've never shown them on this big of a screen, and I'm very excited. But
we will definitely take the opportunity, I promise you.
So really, that's my intro to me and my book, and yeah, excited to get into it.
Thanks so much. And Professor Burnham?
Is this on? So I am truly out of my depth here with Menachem, but I'll try to survive. I actually also read something of his that I didn't realize was his until, of course, you know, Google. And I went back and read it again. It had to do with how to create a Passover meal that used matzah, but it didn't taste like matzah. You could turn it into something really delicious. That was you, right? Anyway, so this is a fabulous book. Everyone should buy it. It's part sort of moral inquiry, part adventure story, and part personal journey, personal growing up story. Meet my family, meet my grandfather, meet my great-grandfather, meet the kin. So it's an absolutely fabulous book. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm here to talk about a particular aspect of the book, and that's what Menachem has described as his engagement with the politics of repair and reparation. And he does that most prominently in chapter 5 of the book. So if you don't read anything else, students out there, and you want to know about his take on reparations, read chapter 5. And it's a really, really really classy way of putting these issues together, because he engages in this Socratic debate with himself about the morality of going thousands of miles away from either New York or Toronto, wherever he was living at the time, the life he was living at the time, or maybe it was Lithuania, I don't know, to a place to locate a building that is owned by his grandfather, and not a building that his grandfather actually happened to live in, but that one that was a development property, essentially, income-producing property for his grandfather that his grandfather lost. This is years after the Holocaust. It's years after Poland has moved through a period of communism and recovered from all of that, or transformed itself from all of that. It's years after property was really not property in Poland, and there are people living in the building who are probably Menachem's age, or maybe younger even, who know very, very little about his grandfather or his great-grandfather, or anything that happened having to do with the seizure of the building. And so he engages in this debate with himself, you know, in which he says things like, or he says to himself, and he answers himself, "You have nothing to do with this building. You never even knew about this building until a few years ago, and now you're coming out of nowhere to claim it. Call it what you will, but the fact of the matter is you don't live here. Your family doesn't live here. No one in your family has lived in for decades, and you don't plan on living here ever. You come to Poland for a couple months of the year. You're not really here. You're not really much more than a glorified tourist. You saw an opportunity to take, assert ownership of this building," and on and on and on. And you know, and it's a debate that situates the central questions of reclamation and repair. It's a series of what ifs of, you know, but his answers are a series of, like, you know, it's mine, it's my family's, what if, but also, and you know, and his partner in this dialogue is like, "Really, dude? Really? You're coming back here after all this time to claim a building you knew nothing about, cared nothing about, and don't really need the proceeds of? Really, dude?" And the book is, as I say, it's about more than that. It's an incredibly readable book. So go out there and buy it. But in that part of in that piece of the book, in that message of the book, Menachem is engaging with, first of all, the positionality of people who are partners or accidental partners in an exchange about reclamation and repair. And so you have the Poles with whom he's engaged in this conversation, who take the position, look, I really had nothing to do with this. I wasn't alive. And then you have Jews himself, 2 generations removed, who say, well, look, it's my family's. It was my family's. It still is my family's. It's legally my family's. It's morally my family's. And so the question is, how those 2 positions can be in dialogue. Is it possible for those 2 positions to be in dialogue and to resolve such a dialogue in terms that are meaningful and just for both sides? The discourse also raises the question, for me, of the importance of genealogy in this debate around reparations. And I say that because this is all about his genealogy. It's all about his grandfather and his great-grandfather and his clan. But for that clan, but for that genealogy, one wouldn't have a claim, essentially. The claim is based on that. But to say that is also to say that there are ways in which, in order to create a just world, we need to move away from genealogy. We need to move away. We need to move into a position of humanhood that doesn't depend on our gene pool or our genealogy or our ancestors. And so there's a way in which claims for reparation that are based on group membership, necessary though that membership may be to make the claim, also reinforce categories that themselves destroy our common humanity. And that was, I saw the dilemma that it presented for him, and he presents that really nicely in this Socratic dialogue. And related to that is the question of group claims that are central to the issue of reparations. As I said a moment ago, we make these claims based on our membership, based on our identity, but in doing so, you are reinforcing the identities that had something to do with the original harms in the first place, and that's problematic. I also looked at this dialogue and asked myself the question whether the claims for the building, the claims that Menachem is making that the building is his, is a personal claim or a claim based on state-sponsored wrong. And it seems to me that there's a difference here. If this is a personal claim, well, then it's just like any other tort or any other wrongful seizure that has nothing to do with a larger politic. If, on the other hand, we're talking about a claim to remediate a state injustice, well, that situates the claim in a slightly different way. And I must say that throughout the book, although I love the book, I wasn't actually clear which of those positions the author was taking there. I also asked myself the question as I read that chapter in the book, whether the reclamation really ameliorates the injustice in this case. Does this really make it better? And what is it we're trying to make better? And that too, I think, though Menachem grapples with it not just in this one chapter, but throughout the chapter, I think left me with as many questions as it did resolutions. So Menachem writes at a time when there was resurgent debate really all across the world, but here specifically in the United States where we sit and study, on the question of reparations, on the question of how the past relates to our understanding of the present and how it relates to how we scope out and map out a future that we all want for ourselves and for our progeny. And these issues are, really at their height at the moment, and certainly the conference that we had today was a testament to the ways in which what was a fairly fringe claim in the United States, a claim for reparations for the harms of slavery, slavery, post-slavery, and Jim Crow have traveled into the fairly mainstream political discourse and ended up in laws and resolutions in places as far away as California, Evanston, Illinois, and close here at home, Amherst, Massachusetts. So this didn't happen overnight. Of course, it happened as a result of a consistent movement to make such claims and to present such claims in legal form over a long period of time. But at the bottom, at root, this is a contestation about how we understand the past. It's about how we understand the linkages between the past and the present. That's what the debate is all about. And though for those of us who believe that the past, that our past here in the United States has influenced and still creates a legacy for the harsh and stark racial inequities in economic and otherwise in our country today, well then it might be apparent and indisputable that some form of repair is appropriate. For those who take the position that slavery is over, long time over, Jim Crow is actually also over, segregation is actually over as well. The story of today has nothing to do, inequities persist, but they have nothing to do with our victory over those horrors and state-sponsored injustices. And that whatever legacies there are need to be attended to without reference to a past which is merely, has the potential politically to fracture and divide the country the more we dwell on it. So that, it strikes me, is really a debate which is raised by Menachem's book, but obviously is at a very sharp and perhaps tipping point here in the United States. So what I will say is, in conclusion, and then of course we'll have some discussion, is when we say the past matters, without the past one can't really fully understand how we got to where we are today, and therefore we have to attend to the past. Other people, those who take a different view, will say, well, actually, obviously the past matters, but we ought not to carry it into the future. We heard this, for example, when recently Barbara Lee presented in Congress a resolution to establish a truth commission that could create a record that could support H.R. 40, which is the reparations bill that's been pending in Congress for many, many years. And in response to that, Mitch McConnell said, "Well, look, slavery's over. This is a done deal. We're not two nations. We don't want to divide ourselves into two nations. We're not a debtor and creditor nation." And I guess in part one could also say that the problems of reparation, and I think this became clear today in our discussions today with legislators, that the fundamental theoretical, conceptual challenges of reparations programs have not really fully been worked out sufficiently so that we have an answer for people like McConnell, who say that trafficking in a past gives us no purchase on the future. So I could say more, but I think I'll give Simon an opportunity to open it up.
Well, before
and I hope that Menachem will pardon me for reading from his book.
No, you did a wonderful job in tying those threads together. So hard to clap with the microphone. Before I intrude with my own questions and commentary, I think first, Margaret has given Menachem so much, I think, probably to think about, and so I thought I'd give you a chance to respond. Well, I can give you direction if you want, but I thought you might be itching.
Yeah, I guess just maybe to what it was a really interesting formulation how you talked about sort of coexisting as sort of like the Polish history and my Jewish history, and I'll say sort of my experience with that, like my own narrative. When I started doing this reclamation process, I really kind of inherited a narrative, which was basically, I would call it like the Jewish or maybe even American attitude towards like this property, which was, very unnuanced. It was like my family owned this property. It still owns this property. There's really nothing else to talk about. And I got a lot of pushback, and in a way that I didn't anticipate. And really the chapter that Margaret was referencing, where I engaged in this dialogue, were kind of actual conversations with many different people, which I sort of took and smushed into this sort of dialogue with myself. And people were accusing me of appropriation. And I got very, very defensive, especially at the outset, because I couldn't understand it. I was like, well, I would offer a counterfactual. I was like, okay, if my family hadn't been murdered, if there was a kind of a line of continuity in the city of Sosnovich, then no one would object the fact that my family still owned this building because they always owned the building. But it took me, a while. It took me, I would say, like 2 years to sort of appreciate sort of the underlying truth, which was that there's another narrative here. And so can you sort of open up, at least, not necessarily embrace, but at least sort of be cognizant and be aware of this other narrative without impugning upon your own sort of moral and legal rights. And I found that to be like a very, very delicate dance. The idea of like my moral and legal rights, I felt sort of solid. I felt that they were good. But I was like, can I sort of appreciate the fact that other people's lives are sort of tied up in this property? I will say as an aside, Margaret she spoiled it, but I'm okay with all spoilers, that, I had spent about 2 years at that point building sentimental relationships with the people in this building before I found out I was in the wrong building. So it was, in fact, the addresses had changed, and the building I was trying to reclaim was actually up the street. But I had built this relationship, so I was like, I'm still in these relationships, and I'll come back to that in a second. But what I did, I was like, okay, I have to sort of at least know who these people are. I have to sort of be aware of that other narrative, of the fact that we are sort of entangled in the story. And again, can I sort of defend my moral legal rights and also sort of at the very least, be aware of theirs? And I went and I just knocked on doors. I will say at first I was a huge coward. I didn't have the chutzpah to tell them the truth because I was afraid of confrontation. I was knock on doors and they're like, hey, you want to talk? My grandfather used to own this building. I'm trying to take it back. People, for anyone, I think that'd be a scary proposition. And in Poland in particular, there's like a very deep suspicion, sort of blown out of proportion, but still, of like the Jew coming back for their property. And so I made up some like ridiculous lie of like, I'm a researcher interested in Sosnovich real estate, which was insane. It was crazy. And then you know what? Can we show the first slide? And so, when I first went, I traveled with a photographer named Jason Francisco. And that was the first time we went in the building. We came up with that lie. We're like, hi, we're here to research the building. And Jason is a very, very talented photographer. So he came with his like fancy camera, and it was me. And then we had like a handler / translator. So we were like a big party. And this was, the first person we tried to talk to slammed the door in our face. She just slammed the door. Then we saw this man renovating. And we went downstairs and we're like, can we talk to you? And he was immediately open before he knew who we were, really what we were there. And I will say the conversation is recorded in the book kind of at length because within, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, he began to open up and he told me the story of meeting his mother for the first time in 40 years. And he's 40. And so he really met his mother abandoned him when he was 6. He went to live with his grandparents in this building. And then he came back and he met his mother when he found out that a brother he didn't know existed was having a wedding. And so like this was the kind of he was really opening up to me and letting me into, again, that kind of narrative. And his grandparents lived in this building. I will say this building. Could you go to the actually number 2, number 3? I mean. And so that guy, the first guy's name was Bartek, and like very quickly, as soon as he opened up to me, I felt just very silly. And I felt a lot of shame. I'm like, how could I hide from him? And so I told him who I was, and I was trying to reclaim the property. He's like, well, he sort of didn't blink. And then he introduced me to Hannah. And just as this is like really just a little bit of a detour to give you a sense of like really opening up and sort of what I found. And Hannah, she lived on 1A. And Hannah, she was an architect. Her father was an architect, and her brother was an architect. But not only was her father an architect, he was the city planner. And Hannah had devoted basically her entire adult life to a study of the real estate history of this city. And so she started that first visit. She started bringing out maps, and not just like any, silly consumer maps, sort of professional grade maps. Some of them which were, I think, stolen from the city archives, and like stretching back to Imperial Russia, German maps. And so like the coincidence, or whatever you want to call it, of like encountering the person with the most expertise in the world of the very question I was chasing. And it became clear that this story in particular, this building had like an unbelievably rich history. It was designated as a building for the provincial theater, and everyone in the property during communist times was part of the theater. So you had like the directors, the actors, the costumers, and even today, a lot of them sort of were related to the theater in some way. But this is that was my encounter with like their narrative of the building. Again, it was the wrong building, but I couldn't do it. Could you go back one? And so this is actually the correct building. And like really just sort of building on what Margaret said about sort of like this embrace of that like coexistence. And this is sort of, I'm still sort of a coward at heart. I ran out of steam. And so like this is sort of, I really struggled at moral and ethical question, but it bumps up against my sort of spiritual stamina, if you will. And I never met anyone in this building. And this is a building I'm still trying to reclaim. And I think that's wrong. I think that's an act of cowardice. But it was something like I really struggled with, and I just could not do it after I spent all that time in the first one, which I do not have a picture of. The rest are treasure hunter photos. But yeah, that's a long-winded response.
No, that was wonderful. And I think what you're talking about is something that Margaret mentioned, this wonderful term, accidental partners, right? Discovering people who you are entangled with, which illustrates a lot of the complications of the restitution process, right? So the debate that that Margaret highlighted in terms of the parallel over reparations and your own Socratic debate, right, is about the fact that this isn't just about money. It's not just about property, right? It's about challenging a particular narrative, right? If you claim that property, right, and that is also saying that it was stolen from your family, right? And to Mitch McConnell, right, if there are reparations, it also suggests that there is a continuation of sin, right? There's one of my favorite lines in the book is where you say, "It is remarkable how long an act of violence can echo," and I think that this is something shared in both of these processes, these continued multi-generational echoes of violence.
Yes.
Margaret, you could.
Yeah, I found myself in a weird position because I tried to be very, very honest about my motivations, and it really basically almost ruined the book. Arguably, maybe it did ruin the book, but I didn't have that sense of I was doing this for my grandfather because I did not know him, and so I didn't feel comfortable acting in his name or for his sake. And so it was really bumping up against like, and I'm very uncomfortable being sort of a spokesperson or sort of like, this is like a mission, this is important, because I'm not saying it's not, but like, I was like, I'm not in touch with those motivations, and like, there is no sense of completion of this mission, because it wasn't mine, and like my grandfather never told me about it, and like I don't want to invent that. And so, like Margaret, you were like dead on when you're like, this seems to be an open question throughout the book. Is it like this idea belongs to my family, or is it sort of a response, like a fix to this sort of violence? And I'm like, I'm not comfortable with the idea of it being sort of a bigger mission than just my own personal journey, and sort of like I can only sort of claim on what I see and what I experience. But yeah, sort of the sentimentality of it was something I really struggled with.
So I have a question for both of you, and that's about the process itself of seeking restorative justice or justice to a past injustice. And towards the end of the book, you actually ask yourself, what am I going to feel if I actually achieve this, right? You know, let's say I'm successful, then what, right? And I'm wondering, you know, and Margaret, you have experience. You have experience with this issue both in the United States and South Africa, and I have to imagine that this was a central question in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, whether the process itself, the sort of therapy of the process itself, is as important as the end result.
So I think these are two different things. I think there is something to be said for the process itself, because it again, you know, it's about it's relational. The process itself of truth telling, of repair, is, you know, repair is the process of repair is the process of life. We're constantly repairing, and so. So that itself, it has intrinsic value. In South Africa, as Angel could tell us, there's a lot of discussion about the result, and whether the TRC sort of oversold its mission and its purpose in the South African journey to a new form of justice after apartheid. First of all, there was some discussion about whether or not the TRC made compromises that defeated the purpose of enlarging, you know, equity in South Africa. And second of all, there was a question whether this focus on apartheid itself, as distinct from the long history of colonialism in South Africa, this sort of spectacular brutality of apartheid, taking it out and separating it and concentrating it for the international spotlight, whether that itself was a serious departure from the full history of oppression, suppression, and white rule in South Africa that begins really with the colonial era. So on both those grounds, first of all, that the results were not structurally transformational in any sense, and that it misinterpreted or shortchanged the full history of relationships, white and black relationships in South Africa, relationships of oppression in South Africa. But on both of those fronts, there were serious questions about the TRC. Having said all that, I will also say, I will repeat that, you know, truth-telling is about self-regard. It's about relationships. It's about, you know, it's not just about identifying perpetrators and victims. It's also about identifying beneficiaries who are not themselves perpetrators and calling them into account. So the process itself should be separated from the results in order fully to critique the value of the TRC, is what I would say about the TRC process in South Africa.
Yeah, my expertise is definitely just limited to Poland. But I will say that there was a huge difference for process and result for me. The results tended to be, that's with my example and of other people I know who've done the reclamation process, was that was basically a personal mission. So you're like, okay, you got it, and it means what it means. And I think that's a complicated question. Like for me, the building became, as the story went on, less about a building than whatever sort of meaning I was projecting onto it. It was a symbol, which is interesting, and you do what you want with it. But the process, I think, was very handy and much more of a collective, because it was exposing like the inequalities and inefficiencies of the system. And so like the only way I was able to sort of get any handle on like the legal process and see how stacked it was against people trying to do this was sort of getting into it. And so like, you know, at the end of the book, I sort of imagined what would happen if I got the building back in 2 weeks, you know, and that would be like, then who, like, what then? Like, did I win? Like, does it sort of give me any insight into who my grandfather was? No. But the process to see how complicated it was and how lacking it was in sort of like any sensitivity towards people, not just Jews, but people who had been dispossessed and populations that had been like displaced or deleted in trying to get back their property or be compensated for what was taken. That's a question of process.
And justice is abstract, right? And so, and so, you know, both of you are describe a process in which sometimes the law itself is depersonalized, and it's difficult to have an answer of when has justice been achieved, right? At what point can one feel that justice has been done to an injustice? These are very difficult questions for sure. I want to before I turn it over to the students. I want to talk about treasure hunting because a big part of this book is about actually a relative of your grandfather who you discover, who has his own Holocaust memoir, and provides a window for you into both a whole other side of your family, and also a whole other way in which people in Poland remember these events and deal with what's quite literally underground. So you suggested to me, well, I don't know if it's relevant. It's really interesting, but I don't know if it's relevant. And I would suggest that we are everywhere walking on ground that's soaked with blood, that is complicated, that where are places that we enjoy and have positive associations with and are trying to disentangle, right? I like to go with my family to Deer Island, which is an island off the coast of one of the Boston Harbor Islands, which is a beautiful place to go to the beach and take your dog. That is a place where Native people were interred during King Philip's War, most of whom starved to death, and some were sold into slavery. What we do with this sort of with the presence of trauma and is all around us in most places we live or people live. And on the one hand, you struggle with how they remember this because on the one hand, it is a form of memorialization, but on the other hand, there is also a deep distortion involved. And so I thought that it might be worthwhile for you to explain to the students how this came to be, and especially I think the distortions of memory that you discuss in the book around conspiracy theories that really change how these events could be interpreted.
Okay, so I'm going to explain. It's not going to make sense for like 4 minutes, and then it will, so I beg patience. In the province of Silesia, which is in southwest Poland, near the town called Wałbrzych, are a series of underground tunnels built by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor. It's called Project Riza. There are 7 of them. None of them are completed, but the ones closer to completion are massive. We're talking, I'm going to use the metric system, apologies, square kilometers in size. You have like ceilings that are like like 20, 25 meters tall, which is like 60, 70 feet or something. You have like
Don't look at me, I'm Canadian too.
you have like rooms that are 200 to 300 feet long. These are like massive, like underground neighborhoods. Now, they are sort of bewildering to behold, but what makes them truly enigmatic and strange is that there is virtually no primary documentation as to what the Germans were planning to do with these. So they've become like a major source of mystery among the treasure hunters, who I'll get back to in 1 second. In 2015, and maybe some of you remember this, there was international news when two of these so-called treasure hunters announced to the world that they had found something called the Golden Train. Now, the Golden Train is an ostensibly legendary train full of looted gold that was parked inside of a mountain. I read about that in 2015. I was like, what is this? At that time, I'd spent like 5, 6 years researching World War II and Holocaust-related subjects, and I had never heard about any treasure hunters or golden trains. I was very, very interested. And so at the time I was writing a novel. I was in graduate school for fiction. And I was like, this is a great set piece for a novel. And so I read everything, and this one name kept popping up, named Joanna Lemparska. And she seemed to be like an author and historian, sort of the go-to authority on treasure hunters. And I reached out to her. I was like, Joanna, would you take me on a tour? And so she said yes, and that summer in 2016, she took me on a 2-day tour, and so she showed me some of these tunnels. We'll get to in 1 sec. But she also introduced me to the culture of treasure hunters. And to give you a sense, the treasure hunters are a massive community, easily over 100,000 people, and this includes sort of, you know, the hobbyists, guys who go out with metal detectors and divining rods on the weekend, and it also includes very sophisticated, sometimes even sponsored expedition groups using high-end equipment like magnetometers or LiDAR and drones and radar and things like that. She introduced me to two of these guys who were my guides for some of these tunnels. One named Andrzej, another named Janek. Could we actually go to slides? Yeah, skip this one. We'll come back. Okay, this is actually from that first trip when I met Andrzej and Janek, and they took me. So this was one of the smaller ones. This one is called Sobon, and this is a Nazi tunnel on the side of a mountain. Half the tunnels are open to the public, and half you just need to know a treasure hunter to take you or the GPS coordinates. This is one of the smaller ones, and it doesn't give off how dark it is, but this was like 75 feet into the earth. It was pitch black, and it's sort of flooded. And I have to say, this is from that first visit. I walked in, and my brain kind of broke. Like, it was one thing to read about Nazi tunnels on the internet. It's another thing to sort of go in, and you're like, what is this place? And the fact that there was no sort of information about it or no reliable information was really sort of confounding. Could you, the next slide? That's also from Sobon. Wow, they're so big, these photos. And then the next one. Okay, so this is from one of the larger ones that is open to the public. This is called Osufka. And here you can see the reinforced concrete and get a sense of what it's going to look like. And then the next slide. And here, this is how they did the engineering. All this is original. Those rail tracks are from World War II, how they would cart out the rubble. They would build like one tunnel on top of another and then collapse. And then the next slide. Okay, that ceiling is over 60 feet tall, and the room is something like 150 feet long. These are massive. And then the next one. From where the photographer is standing until the back of the back wall, I think is like 250 or 300 feet. So these were huge, huge complexes, one of the largest infrastructure projects in the world up until that point. Okay, I hang out with Andrzej and Janek, and we're just hanging out having a beer after they showed me some of these tunnels. And you know, I was asking them all these softball questions like, you know, what do you guys find? What are you treasure hunting? What's your work? Blah, blah, blah. But I was with a friend of mine. I brought Jason, the photographer, and Maya, who's a writer. And Maya asked a question that I would not have had the chutzpah to ask. She said, you know, you're all very macho. Yeah, they're very macho. They show up in like camo with like cool toys and Land Rovers and all this stuff. And Maya asked, you know, all very macho and cool, but what about the fact that 14,000 Jews died digging these tunnels? Like, how does that figure into your narrative? How do you approach these sites? And Andrzej, who was like sort of the leader, he got very, very animated, and he started speaking very, very quickly in Polish. I do not speak Polish. And sort of the conversation got too fast for it to be translated by Joanna. And so basically I just sat back and waited until the conversation was over so Joanna could tell me what they were talking about. But I suddenly started hearing inside their conversation, I started hearing my last name. which is Kaiser. And they did not know my last name, so they weren't talking about me. And then I don't know if you've ever had this experience of hearing your name in a foreign language. You're not sure if it's that, and then they say it another time, and then eventually I just stopped them. I'm like, who are you talking about? And they said, Abraham Kaiser. And then they said one of the most important people to have come out of the war, Jew or Pole, which is not a sentiment you hear often from rural Poles. And they're like, who's that? And he said, he was one of the slave laborers, and he wrote a secret diary. And he wrote them on stolen scraps of cement packaging. And after the war, he went back and collected these scraps, and it got turned into a book. That book, which was published in 1962 in Polish, called Zatrzutami Śmierci, Behind the Wires of Death, that book, because of the complete lack of documentation about these tunnels, has become kind of a sacred text among the treasure hunters. They'd all studied it. I would later come to meet treasure hunters who'd read it more than 40 times, or who would every year follow the pilgrimage of Abraham Kaiser from camp to camp. I said, interesting, a funny coincidence. And then when I went to a Sufka, which is this one, they had a gift shop. And at the gift shop, I saw Abraham's book, which was in Polish. I couldn't read it, and I bought it. And then that night, I couldn't sleep, and there was a preface written by museum researchers, which I Google translated. I scanned it in my phone, and I translated it in Google. And I realized Abraham was born in the city next to my grandfather, which sort of the sister city. And then using sort of all the documents I had from my reclamation efforts, I was able to construct a family tree. And I realized that Abraham and my grandfather were first cousins. And so that meant Abraham was the closest surviving relative that my grandfather had. My grandfather, his siblings had been murdered, his parents had been murdered, all of his aunts and uncles had been murdered, and as far as we knew, up until the point, all of his cousins had been murdered. And so in a flash, my family went from extinct to not extinct. And then over the next couple of years, I, because of my connection to Abraham, became a major celebrity among the treasure hunters. And so the second thread of the book is really my descent, pun fully intended, into the treasure hunter community. And then with the conspiracy theories, I guess a little complicated.
I want to open it up to the students.
So you want to go to the slide 4?
I think it's an important issue in terms of historical memory.
Oh, no, yeah, this one. So basically, as I started hanging out with the treasure hunters, I started encountering a ton of very, very strange conspiracy theories, which initially I dismissed, but when I realized it was kind of endemic to this subculture, I realized I really had a journalistic responsibility to investigate it. And it was also very interesting and very fun. Basically, because there is no documentation about these tunnels, they've sort of birthed a very, very strange, absurd conspiracy theories. And so let's see some of them. They're like that the Nazis were building a time travel machine, anti-gravity, nuclear power, that they were dealing with aliens, ancient civilizations. They were putting bases on the moon, in Antarctica, and lasers and time. I said time travel. And so this is one of the so-called quote unquote technical military museums that's attached to one of those tunnels. And this, so the museum claims, is a landing rig for a Nazi flying saucer. I don't know if you could get scale, but that thing is like, I think it's like 150 feet wide in diameter and something like 50 feet tall. It is huge, and it is very weird when you see it. And so, yeah, they claim that this is part of that. And the most research-intensive chapter in the book, by far, maybe by a factor of 10, was when I started trying to really grapple with the conspiracy theories. And my takeaway is that even though they're absurd and really fun, they're in fact very pernicious and very dangerous, because they sort of emphasize the Nazis as sort of heroes or protagonists, and they de-emphasize the dead. And the way I phrase it is rebalancing the moral weight of the war. And so it wasn't something that was obvious to me. And while I was writing that chapter, that was the shooting in Pittsburgh happened like that week. And you could see Robert Bowers, I think his name was, he had bought into a whole host of conspiracy theories, which were clearly absurd about, the caravan being financed by Soros and things of that nature. And so really that was a kind of an eye-opener for me of seeing the dark side of the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, but I think you raise a really interesting point in the book in grappling with the conspiracy theories, that that there are ways in which memory can be distorted, like you said, so that the victims themselves are sort of tertiary to the larger crime. I mean, if I think of, let's say, critiques of Gone with the Wind, the movie, let's say Gone with the Wind, where it's a romantic story set in the South, and slavery almost becomes tertiary to the story itself. But I think now would be a perfect time to open things up to students who I'm sure have questions and comments. Is that a scratch or a hand?
Thank you guys. Thank you guys so much for being here. This has been a really amazing discussion from all of you. On the basis of reparations, whether on a sort of policy side of things or whether on an emotional side of things, when you're sort of conceptualizing when do the reparations stop, when do they end, where is the, as you sort of spoke to it, when do you decide if things have been ameliorated, can they be ameliorated? Like, how do you, like, when planning them, do you plan, like, we're going to give, someone this much money or this building, when do you decide where that ends? Do you decide during the process? Do you decide before the process? Is that something that inherently can't be decided until you're in the thick of it, sort of in that sort of emotional process? Just sort of curious how, if you've experienced any of that sort of thought process.
Reparations is about balancing current day inequities that are based in past injustices. And so I guess the simple answer would be when those injustices have been rebalanced, then you can say that when it doesn't matter whether you can benefit from all the things that are available to you as a resident citizen of, say, the United States of America, what your race is, then the reparations program becomes immaterial to what it means to be a citizen of the United States. But so long as these injustices continue, injustices which are based in state policy over many, many years, so long as they continue, and so long as they continue to grow the inequities, reparations projects are still in order. And so, in that sense, I think one needs to see reparations not as a project that begins and ends. For example, reparations to Japanese Americans, people of Japanese descent, Japanese Americans in 1980, which had a beginning and an end, but rather to see a reparations project that is seeking to address the huge economic inequities associated with racial supremacy, white supremacy, and race, and when those inequities no longer have salience in our daily lives and in our public policy.
Hello, my name is Chris Thomas, student of journalism. I had two questions, one for each of you. Okay. The first is for you. I thought it was very interesting your the argument that slavery is over, and that is the reason why this makes the conversation about reparations so much more complex. I've been researching a lot the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the officers, and it happened in a context where, well, it wasn't clear that whether or not the story was one of police brutality or racial profiling or of urban poverty and crime. And the more I read, the more I realized it was about all of these things, and they were very intimately related. And and in the book, the quote, "echoes of violence," really struck with me, and I thought that, you know, police brutality was an echo of that violence, and so I wondered if that argument carried any weight, and how do you separate those threads? Because in LA, I mean, a lot of the socioeconomic inequality affected not just blacks but also um, um, all kinds of minorities, and yeah, I was wondering what you made of that, if you had reflected on that.
If you could summarize, Margaret couldn't hear some of your question.
Okay. um,
So I think I could be wrong, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the student is asking about how one deals with the fact that these echoes of violence have practical implications on a daily basis, and that there may be no form of historical restitution or injustice that could correct those. Is that more or less?
Yes, yes, the echoes of violence do have practical implications, and my reflection on the Rodney King incidents was one of those. I was wondering if that weight that that slavery was over had any, if that argument had any weight, or how do you piece apart the fact that socioeconomic inequality, urban poverty, and violence, and are intimately connected? How do you piece those apart, and how do they become? Just my question.
I don't have the answer, but I think it's a wonderful point, which is that that I think the student's offering a counter to the idea that slavery is over, right?
Yes, I'm saying that there are violent repercussions, or at least the attitudes that were born have manifested, and that was something that wasn't like, it wasn't just racist attitudes. It was urban crime, and it was poverty, and it was economic inequality, and those were in part a result of racist attitudes that were born from a history of slavery. So
yeah, I think Professor Burnham is very much in agreement, because one of the points that she made was that as a counter to the idea that slavery is over, that there can't really be reparations until these, as a society, we're not dealing with these violent echoes anymore. I know Professor Landsmark also wants to add.
Well, I'm curious if Professor Burnham could summarize some of the takeaways from the conference that took place earlier today. And as a question, I wonder if you could respond to why it is that affirmative action programs of the 60s and 70s, which were sometimes couched in terms of providing a kind of, if not reparations, at least step towards healing, appear to have failed.
Okay, so thanks for that. Professor Landsmark's question was, first of all, to say a word or two about this morning's session with legislators around the reparations issue, and secondly, to compare initiatives around affirmative action to the current reparations initiatives. So first, on the first question, and let me just say to the person who spoke earlier, I was having a hard time hearing you. It's not you, it's me. I'm sorry. But if what I heard you say is that the slavery still resonates in today's experiences, then of course I agree that it does. And by experiences, I'm talking about experiences that have to do with our life opportunities, whether we can get the education that we need for ourselves and our children, whether we can live in places that are safe and secure, whether we can obtain a mortgage or rent an apartment anywhere anywhere we want to. All of these things are in some sense determined by policy. These are not, we live in a world where you don't see you don't see it, but it completely determines the kind of life that you have and the opportunities that you have in life. And to some extent, those policies, perhaps not, maybe intentionally, but even if unintentionally, tend to benefit those who hold the most wealth and power in the country, and are to the disadvantage of those who are powerless. And that is certainly a legacy of historical imbalances and white supremacy. So on the question of this morning's discussion, we pulled together state and local legislators who are trying to translate the call for reparations, the claim that you've just made, the argument that you've just made about the need for reparative justice, to how does that get translated into policy? And by policy, what I'm referring to is if you have a reparations program, you need to know exactly what injustice you're seeking to address. Are you talking about housing? Are you talking about police misconduct? Are you talking about mass incarceration? Are you talking about miseducation, prison to jail to prison pipeline? Exactly which aspect of racial injustice are you seeking to address? And once you decide that, you still have next to decide, well, who are the beneficiaries of this reparations program going to be? So as we know, there's no homogeneity in any community. In the African American community, there are some people who hold a lot of wealth, who have a lot of wealth, and even though the majority are economically disadvantaged, there are people who have enormous wealth in the African American community. Are they also, if they are the descendant from slavery, are they, by virtue of that fact, entitled to partake of a reparations program? So there's a question of, who you benefit, and finally there's a question of how you adjust your program so that it meets with the legal requirements that guide our conduct in every other aspect of life and policy in the United States. In U.S. law, we have a thing called the Equal Protection Clause. And so the question is whether or not you can just give out a check. And I forgot to mention the whole question of what the remedy is going to be, parenthetically. Are we talking about an individual remedy, my building, my repair, my money? Or are we talking about a community remedy that would provide for broad, for example, for broad access to health care for those who have been historically disadvantaged, people of color, African Americans, and other people of color in this country, historically disadvantaged and excluded from health care. So those are the questions that the policymakers today were grappling with, really getting down to the brass tacks of, okay, there's a call for reparations. How do we do it? How do we effectuate it? We all know the why, right? We all know the why. The why is all around us. The why is in the inequity, right? That the brutal inequities that characterize our society. That's the why. The harder part is the how. How do we get it done? And that's what folks were grappling with today. On the second question, I think it's important to appreciate that reparations is not a policy that relieves governments from seeking justice in every way it can. So reparations is not an alternative to other policies that may be necessary to equalize the playing field. And affirmative action was one such policy. Affirmative action, I would not consider affirmative action, whether it succeeded or didn't, to be a reparations program. Affirmative action really certainly addressed inequities, but I don't see it as the kind of reparations program that seeks to address these historical wrongs. I could be wrong in that regard, Ted, but certainly, but my larger point here is that government continues to have the obligation to do whatever is necessary to provide justice and access on an equal basis to everyone for whom government is responsible, right? And that's separate and apart from whatever obligation government has to make repair for state injustice, state-sponsored or generated injustices.
Hello, thank you for being here. To follow up on your first answer, what advice, if any, do you have for future policymakers or organizers who are probably in this room when it comes to engaging in this work, especially when it comes to dealing with people who are working in different paradigms than they are or see the world differently? Yeah, since you've been doing this for a long time.
So thank you, and I know someone has a question for Menachem. He came all the way from New York. I came from Jamaica Plains, so you could talk to me anytime. But yes, so thank you so much for your question. Let me just say, you know, reparations is we're talking about reparations today, but it's really only one of many ways to engage in programs, policy, study that addresses inequities in our country. And so learn, for one thing, read a lot, read across disciplines, read history, certainly, study law, read as much as you can to sort of so you're fully grounded. I mean, the thing that was beautiful about Menachem's book, he's not a historian, right? But if he didn't understand history, he could not have written that book, right? So if you want to be a creative writer, a brilliant creative writer like this guy, I'm talking to you guys, I'm talking professor to student here now, folks, right? If you want to be that person, then this is your time to get deep in world history, our history, African American history, all of it, and then you'll be in a position to understand policy and to make policy, and you can do that in any context. You can certainly do that as kind of a public official, but you can do that in a range of different contexts. You can do it, as Menachem did earlier before he became a famous novelist, as a journalist, writing about these critical issues that are facing us and our future today. Sorry for the lecture, guys.
Professor Burnham just made an excellent pitch for classes in our wonderful history department here at Northeastern University. This student right here, and then Jonathan, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. So I might have to read Plunder to get the answer to this, but I was just curious. You mentioned how, like, your family didn't really talk much about your grandparents in the past. So I'm just curious to hear, like, how your family reacted to this journey you embarked on and the process of everything and finding out all this information about your ancestral history.
They didn't. Well, okay. To peel back the curtain, the book comes as a book, but it was 5 years of my life. And so while this is going on, I was telling my parents what was happening, and more or less, I would say they were bemused. And it was like sort of Menachem's zany adventures in Poland, and they nothing really pieced together, and they were kind of lost. When the book became a book, which is actually before the book comes out, when like it's sort of imminent, and they're like, "Oh my God, it's going to be a book that other people will read." Two things happened. One is they got very nervous. My parents are very observant Orthodox Jews, and let's call it very sensitive to image, like public image within the community. So there was a lot of nervousness. I also write about a feud in the family between my father and with my father and his siblings, which had to do with real estate and inheritance, which absolutely complicated and informed my quest. And so there was discussion around that. And then, but on the other side, there was also, it cohered. And so the book was a book. It was something that they could read and understand. And all those sort of zany, scattered adventures became a story. And in that sense, it was a real gift to my family because they were like, oh, someone took the time beyond the fact that like other people are reading it and they could be proud of me and, be Jewish parents about it. There was also like, this is for our family, the history is now sort of collected and told and understood. And so I think there was pride, just like even just within the family itself. And then there's all sorts of weird fights that are going to happen, which are inevitable. We fought about like a plastic cover on a couch with my aunt, and my mother asked me to take out the curse words, and I took out all the curse words because I'm a good son. Except, am I allowed to say certain words on the thing?
You can say anything you want.
Except penis.
Because that's not even a curse word.
I know. But the child, I was like, my mother's like, could you please take it out? I was like, if you could think of a synonym that doesn't sound worse, but she couldn't. So that's in there. So there's, and so it was, it's a little bit of a bomb, within a family when like people are reading about you. And then I was very nervous within my extended family, but it turned out to be fine.
There's just one student here, and then Jonathan and Lori.
Sorry, I'm skipping in front of you. Thank you both for being here. I was curious if you had opinions on the land back movement, as both of being like restorative justice, like in its efficacy, and also in returns, like if there are parallels or if you see parallels to the idea of Nazi plunder and its feasibility in general. So land back being the idea of like giving land back to indigenous communities.
The student's asking about parallels between reclaiming property in Poland that belonged to Jews and the land back movement restoring indigenous lands to people in the Americas or in the United States and Canada, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there are important parallels. I think if a sort of a claim could be, to me, my sort of domain was actually really small. My claim was like, there was like a legal title on this, and the system is sort of denying me those rights. And I think when you sort of apply those to different jurisdictions, different countries, that's something I was like, if the claim is sort of understood and comprehended, even beyond, I don't even know if you have to get to sort of justice or, sort of, which is, I'm way out of my depth there. Like, again, something happened to me and I wrote a book about it. That is the limit of my expertise. But I do think if like, when that claim could be sort of submitted, it just seems, it just strikes me as just like a regular guy, it's common sense. And so that's, it's a short answer because I don't know anything.
Thanks for that.
I had legal title. So we have to be careful about legal title, because certainly legal title is a good starting place, but it can't be the end point. Because, first of all, whose legal system are we actually talking about here? Who built this system and for whom was it built? But on the question of land back, yes, certainly that the whole reparation is about dispossession. And in our country, that is the original dispossession, and so definitely it's part of this broader. The broader question that we ask about how we deal with the past.
Professor Kaufman?
Question for both of you. Menachem, you said that one of the things that came out of your book was that you had to confront a different narrative than the one you had known, which in many ways is what the whole country is doing now, right? The whole debate over the narratives we're taught and other narratives. And I'm wondering, you know, from your experience, if you took away anything about understanding other people's stories and points of view, or whether that's just kind of, you know, a fantasy that we have that somehow people can talk out their problems or come to some understanding. And then for Margaret, your restorative justice project involves sending students very often, law students, sometimes journalism students, down south to investigate cold case lynchings, but also to deal and help the towns, some of whom want to and some of whom who don't, confront their history in public ways or in other ways. And so I'm wondering if you see that as an important part of restorative justice, not just reparations.
Yeah, I have a sort of a pretty banal answer to that, is that I wasn't even aware that my narrative was a narrative. And so there was a sort of an ignorance that wasn't examined. And so like my main takeaway was just, you know, things that seem very familiar, like upon interrogation, turn out to be like far more complicated. That's goes to our personal histories and our legacies and our country's narratives and histories. And so that was my main takeaway, is that sort of things I took for default, which I never really gave much thought to, or certainly nothing resembling critical attention, started as soon as I did, started crumbling. And that's true not just in terms of like this, you know, story of reclamation. That was true about everything. So really, that would be my takeaway or tip, if you would, yeah.
My answer would be similarly that when we do go to these, this can't be just a one-way street. It's got to be a huge avenue, a wide avenue, moving in many different directions. And so we do take these cases back to the communities where the incidents occurred, and help the families who have suffered from these horrible things engage with their communities and with other communities, with their larger communities in these areas. And these might end up in events, they might end up in shared narratives, new narratives, rewritten narratives, but certainly the idea is to visibilize these things in local histories, so that they are then owned by those communities. And you can't have people say, oh gee, I really didn't know that. I never knew about that. I didn't know that happened. And so that certainly is part of why we do what we do.
Is there a microphone for Professor Lefkowitz?
Thank you. I mean, this was an amazing conversation, and I have a million questions, but like, what happened with the gold train? That's one of them. And the huge mystery of this tremendous Nazi architecture, and really, we don't know anything. So I have those pieces of curiosity, but I also want to. I have a question to Menachem about your emotional response to, and maybe intellectual response, but I think emotional response to recent legislation in Poland around what you're allowed to claim the Poles did or didn't do around their Jews, and how that intersects with your quest. And I asked this question, I just want to share that much of my family story is like your family story, but because I'm old, I'm a generation closer to these traumas, and I knew all the people who were traumatized. And we also had, you know, my grandfather on one side thought he had lost everybody. That is, you know, 7 siblings who were married and all their children and his own parents. And I discovered when the Yad Vashem database was digitized, you know, a few years, not very recently, that one nephew had survived. And in anticipation of a dialogue trip with Northeastern students, I contacted the living members of that family. All the principals were already gone. All the first-degree relatives who would have, delighted in discovering each other were all absent. But I went and visited this newfound family of the Weinsteins of Krosno and discovered that this nephew had gone back to property of ours that, I didn't know, I thought I would never have an address. And I can tell you one amazing, astonishing stories about that, but the most relevant piece is that when they went back to this house, the fear of the return of the Jew, which is a thing you mentioned, and for me, again, this is all connected. The Kitchification of the Jews in Krakow. When I was there, it was just the most astonishing. I mean, Poland was horrifying to me in these ways, and but so the first thing the current owner of the store that had been my grandfather's family's did was, the first thing he did was he pulled out a piece of paper proving that it was legally his, that he had right there in the register, like as if waiting decades and decades for some Jew to show up and say, this is mine. So my question is about how you respond to the new legislation and how recent that, this sort of rejection of Jewish claims. And I just want to share as a last point that my father, who was a survivor of the camps, he and his surviving sibling did receive reparations from Germany, and how very important that was. And my mother-in-law, who was a child survivor and has an astonishing story, didn't receive reparations because she couldn't bear the re-traumatization of the process of entailed in the process of requesting it. So, this is a huge history, not just the Jewish history, but for all peoples who are survivors of trauma. The process of the emotional process, I think, is immensely complicated.
Yeah, to give a little bit of context about sort of my emotional response to the recent legislation. So from 2011 to 2015, I spent a tremendous amount of time in Poland, probably about 2 to 2.5 months per year. And my experience in Poland was overwhelmingly positive. And so this is not really in the book, and it's one of my regrets that it's not in the book. I didn't encounter like antagonism, I didn't encounter conflict, I didn't encounter sort of like Polish anti-Semitism. I found sort of like, I would say almost unqualified curiosity, support, interest in what I was doing in my work. Every year I went, I would say the country was improving. The food got better, my Airbnbs got better, and also sort of like the state infrastructure towards memory was getting better. It was sort of the darling of the EU for those, from the early 2000s to 2015. And there was just tremendous improvement. So the museums, sort of investment in sort of education and Holocaust education, the arts. There was tremendous amount of non-Jewish energy in Jewish arenas. In 2015, a far-right government came to power, which was a nationalist, revisionist, Catholic government, and it was heartbreaking. And, for most of my friends, who were mostly my age, who had either no or very faint memories of communist history, this was really the first time in their life when there was backwards progress, or sorry, there was no, there was regression. And so, right, the backwards progress, otherwise known as regression. And so it was it was really heartbreaking. And so, but it also sort of, for the first time in my time in Poland, I felt involved, sort of politically, because, up until then, I was just sort of, I was a glorified tourist. I really did feel that. I was sort of like skating through. And then all of a sudden, the government launched this sort of reformation that's still being played out in the EU courts of the judiciary. And I was like, whoa, does this affect my case? And so for the last 6 years, there's been this assault on sort of certain democratic principles and also certain, let's call it independent historical thinking. There's a branch of the government in Poland that deals with memory called the IPN, and they are in charge of how the memory gets sort of talked about and sort of their curriculum, museums, textbooks, things like that. And so the large, over the last 5-6 years, seeing this, giant step backwards has been really, really heartbreaking. So really that includes sort of the attacks on certain historical narratives, judicial reforms, seeing museums and search and culture institutions get defunded and things like that. And so it's been very sad.
Thank you. Well, if there are no other student questions, then I'm going to ask the last question and take my privilege with the final, not the final word, but the final question. And to ask, is there possibly also an injustice that is perpetuated through restorative justice in sometimes letting the perpetrators off the hook, right? So there is, when somebody makes an apology, right, that is, or somebody gives reparations, that is also something therapeutic for that party, right? And I think that when I think of, let's say, Menachem's story of, well, his own grandfather was seeking to gain back this this property, but there's, as a family, the narrative was, we don't want that, right? That is gone. Or Professor Lefkowitz's mother-in-law, who says, that I think for many there would be an act of, that there's a desire not to give the satisfaction to the party who is making that act of restoration. I think that would have been at the heart of opposition to German reparations in Israel, which were paid in the 1950s and were deeply controversial. So I guess that's a simple question is to ask is sometimes an injustice done as well when reparations are made if the party making them is able to reconcile with a difficult past.
So I would say we've been, this has been a very rich conversation, but it has also been one which has not been as mindful about categories as maybe we should be as scholars. Restorative justice is really quite different from reparations, which is also quite different from transitional justice, which is also quite different from compensation, right? And so these are all ways of fixing something, but they're fixing different things in different ways and abiding by different principles of justice in doing so. And so we see in our project, we see restorative justice in this light. We understand that justice was denied those whose cases we're investigating. And what we try to do is literally restore a measure of justice by creating an accurate factual narrative and by providing legal remedies when they're available. So that's how we see restorative justice. Reparative justice is really something quite different. Reparative justice speaks to a particular historical wrong and the need to make repair for that historical wrong. It's backward looking. It looks at something that occurred in the past that may or may not have ongoing effects, but that needs to be fixed. There has to be a wrong with respect to reparative justice. As I said earlier, a good example would be what happened in New Orleans, where Hurricane Katrina hit and was devastating for residents across the city. That's a horrible thing. It's not a state injustice. The state does owe all the residents of that city a fix. That has to be repaired, but it's not reparative justice. When the levees broke, then you need to ask the question, did the levees break because this particular community was ignored by the state? And if so, that's a state wrong that requires reparative justice, right? So I think the categories become really important, especially when you're thinking about who are the perpetrators, who are the beneficiaries, and what is the repair, Right. I can't remember the second part of your question.
No, that was wonderful, and I think a very important corrective. Menachem, would you like the last word? You get it anyway.
You know, again, my expertise is super limited, if existent at all. But I think sometimes we get uncomfortable because it's sort of this, you know, in reclamations or reparations implies a certain fungibility between trauma and cash. But I think there's like a secondary goal, which is discourse. I think we have like maybe you know it'd be cool if governments could like engage in therapy, but it's like that's not what's going to happen. But this is sort of our means of forcing discourse, and you see it in Poland. It becomes sort of it's a national issue, and it becomes like when you have certain elections, this becomes like the candidates will debate sort of like property reclamation, and so it's you know it's an unfortunate thing, but like how else do you sort of force the conversation to the forefront without sort of money? But that's
I can't think of a better way to tie things up. And on that note, I just want to say thank you, everybody, so much for being here for this program. And thanks to Professor Landsmark and Professor Kaufman. And Professor Landsmark is going to say a final word.
We'll be back next Wednesday for our last public session in this series. And let's thank our presenters this evening.